Uh, Good morning, everybody. Again, it's my pleasure and honor today to introduce our speaker, Ed Marshall, a fellow Navy veteran. Before I say a few things about Ed in terms of his background, I just want to take a moment to tell you about an incident that occurred in the decade of the 1970s when I was pretty new to this area. I was driving on Willow Road in Glenview. And when you get to a certain point, I think you all probably know it, there's a rise in the hill. Yes, I see heads nodding. On one side now is Patriot Drive. On the other side, you'll find Costco and some other dealers, retailers. And I was driving, and just as I got to the top of that hill in Glenview, over my head, I heard buzzing and engines, and I ducked instinctively. I didn't need to, but I did. When I looked up, I saw, oh, it's a plane. It was landing on the other side of the road. Amazing. So that was my introduction to the Glenview Naval Air Station. And now about Ed Marshall. Ed was born in Chicago, but at a young age, he moved to New York, went to high school there, went to college at William and Mary, and enlisted in the Navy and served from 1956 to 1960 as a petty officer parachute rigger. Now, there's a tough job for you, a big responsibility. You got to make it right every time. Anyway, Ed served at a number of duty stations, including Norfolk, Virginia, the Naval Air Station there. He served at the Glenview Naval Air Station, of course, and he served at the U.S. Navy Parachute Rigger Station or school to learn how to rig those parachutes at the Norfolk, at the Lakehurst, New Jersey Air Station. Now, here's what we're going to do. Ed asked me to introduce this film. The first 20 minutes will give you a little background, and then Ed will come up and elaborate and tell you more about the Glenview Naval Air Station and the museum. So, Jill, can you play the film, please?
Since I can remember, when we were 3 or 4, we were already building model airplanes.
You just gave it a little push and out it'd go, and then you'd watch it and then say, oh damn, there goes my 25-cent kit.
I built, as you see, all these model airplanes that are here. I built model airplanes as a young boy.
So I never did believe that when I was doing that, 9 years old maybe, I was 10, I never realized that I would wind up flying those same things that I was making.
In 1929, America's fascination with flight had reached fever pitch. Chicago was becoming a central hub for aviation in the Midwest. The open farmlands of north suburban Glenview were chosen as the perfect site to build an alternative to the region's then main airport, smog-choked, busy Midway Field. Glenview's Curtis Reynolds Airfield was designed and constructed with every modern amenity of its time, a literal fly-in country club. The stock market had other plans, however, and the crash of '29 was followed by a deep economic depression that kept the elite flying club from ever getting off the ground. During the lean years that ensued, national and international air races were held in Glenview, keeping the airfield financially afloat and bringing visits from aviation pioneers and luminaries such as Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh. But as war loomed on foreign shores, the escapism of the flight shows gave way to the country's need for ready air defenses, and the Navy arrived in Glenview, eventually purchasing all of Curtis Reynolds Airfield. During World War II, Naval Air Station Glenview would play a pivotal role to our victory in the Pacific. Due to the safety of its non-coastal location, Naval Air Station Glenview became the command center for a unique freshwater primary carrier pilot training program during World War II. Using 2 coal-burning paddle wheel makeshift carriers stationed in Lake Michigan, the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable, pilots took off from Glenview, used the Baha'i Temple in Wilmette as a visual landmark, and practiced landings and takeoffs on the ships. Over 17,000 Navy pilots were qualified during this time, including former President George H.W. Bush, who at 19 was the second youngest to qualify at Glenview. Other men who served at Glenview would go on to make extraordinary contributions to our country, including former President Gerald Ford, astronaut Neil Armstrong, and Edward Butch O'Hare. History was made in Glenview when the first African-American Navy pilot, Jesse Leroy Brown, received the first phase of his flight training here in 1946. Through most of the 20th century, Naval Air Station Glenview continued to be crucial to the defense of this country, serving as Cold War U.S. headquarters for both Naval and Marine Reserve Aviation Training Commands. From World War II to the Gulf War, the Naval Air Station Glenview proudly served our country, providing critical training ground for all 5 branches of the military. Wings haven't flown over Glenview now since the Navy closed its runways here for the last time in February 1995. Yet the contributions made here will never be forgotten. Let the stories you are about to hear capture the spirit of everyday heroes who served at Glenview and preserve their own rightful place in Glenview's proud military history.
Well, first thing I told them when I became 16, I was going to join the Navy. But they wouldn't let me join the Navy at 16, so I got my mother's permission to join the Navy. And she says, if that's what you want to do, that's what you're going to do.
I was sort of the youngest in the group, and so they just, they all left, and I said, so I joined the Navy.
Well, the war started, and I was in college. I was not quite through 2 years. It was just about 1 year. And the advertising came out, broadcast about that Navy was looking for Navy pilots. I took the test, and it was quite easy. It was not that hard.
You were nice.
So I was accepted for flight training.
And a month after I was 17, I joined the Navy and really grew up in the Navy. I enlisted on what they called a kiddie cruise. If you went in before your 18th birthday, you were discharged a day before you were 21. So I served 3 years and 11 months. And in those days, the voting age was 21, so I had been in the Navy almost 4 years and still wasn't eligible to vote.
Young servicemen with dreams of flying were required to complete several weeks of ground school before ever seeing the inside of a cockpit. Winning their wings would take about a year. Qualifying to be a carrier pilot required 8 successful takeoffs and landings upon an aircraft carrier in the sea.
This captain was our flight leader, and he was only going to check us out on the carrier. He took 4 of us out, and he said, and he told us on the radio, he said, now I want you guys to look good because there's a lot of Navy guys here, and that Navy ship is going to watch you guys like a hawk.
Okay.
Anyway, we went out to the carrier. I didn't know where it was in the Atlantic somewhere, and we flew out there, and I thought, you know, why wouldn't they be up closer? Well, they just wanted us to learn how to get there. You know?
Navigate out to the
Navigate
ship.
out there, yeah.
Sure.
So the pilot, the skipper, the guy that was leading us, he's number 1, and I'm number 2. And then the second section leader is 3 and 4.
Right.
So the two go around, and we come off first. So he broke, and as he's turning to go into the carrier, I had to fly around one more time. Otherwise, I'd be too close to him.
Right.
So he's telling me on the phone now, get in there tight, and stay and watch me, and see the way I'm coming aboard, and you got to come in and then straighten out. I'm making my turn, and I'm coming around, and I see a big splash in the water. He spun in.
Really?
The pilot, this experienced pilot from Guadalcanal and everywhere else, he's telling me how to fly on the carrier. He got so tight, he wanted to put on such a good show with the carrier people, he goes in the drink.
Oh my gosh.
So, well, he didn't get killed. He
Oh,
just
okay.
flashed the Corsair. It was like a sled. Well, he wouldn't come out of the ready room to see us. He was so embarrassed. So I never saw him before. Never saw him then and ever again.
I like jumping out of airplanes. Well, it's a lot of fun when you're 18 years old. It's very exhilarating, and it gives you a good sense of accomplishment knowing you've done something that, of course, now sport parachuting is very popular. In those days, most people didn't do that. So it was satisfying knowing you're doing something that most people don't have the opportunity to do other than military.
Do you think war is like Hollywood? Everybody comes home, Far from it.
The only one I was at was in Hiroshima, and we took supplies from the supply ships into the beaches so that the guys could get their tanks and things like that on the beaches and everything like that. And we were lucky enough that we were close enough to pick up the guys that had gone into the water. And the gentlemen that were in the tanks were not too lucky. Some of them perished, and some of them closed the hatches, and then when the water filled up, they went out and swam to the surface.
I'm sure.
We all had we have our book that is already authenticated every month. I had to sign it, and then the operations officer signs it. Every time you had 20 missions over the front lines, you got an air medal.
Oh.
It's called Combat Air Medal. So I had 126 missions. If you converted 126 missions into 2 hours each,
Wow.
that's the number of hours you're in combat. And you're bound to get shot at, and nobody likes you. I got the DFC.
The Distinguished Flying Cross.
That's the one on top.
That's the one on top of your ribbons.
Yeah, that's a Distinguished Flying Cross. We were doing our job.
Sure.
And to get a DFC is doing your job, really, but doing it better than normal.
Well, it was really an interesting, there was an old phrase that we used to use. It was hours and hours of boredom broken only by moments of sheer terror. The typical mission would be you would have a pre-flight briefing on the mission itself that would take anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. You had to pre-flight the aircraft, you had to fuel the aircraft, you have to make sure that it's mission capable, mission ready. And then your missions would range anywhere from an 8-hour mission to, in some cases, a 12-hour mission. So those were long flights and required a lot of sort of physical endurance because the environment was not necessarily what one would call user-friendly. The mission was out of Kibi Point in the Philippines. We were on a standard search mission. We were tracking a Russian Akula submarine, which is their most modern submarine. It's a nuclear boat, and so we would fly along at around 150 to 200 feet off the water, tracking this submarine, and we just happened to see on the horizon a little tiny dot, and flew over to it, and I found a boat dead in the water. In other words, it had no power. And on the top of this boat, it had SOS painted on it, and it said VN refugees. That we went out in the sea lanes, were able to find a container ship called the Andersmarsk, Dutch ship. And then we dropped flares in the water to guide that ship out of the sea lane to pick up those refugees.
I was on a CAP, a Combat Air Patrol. I was circling. They called me and said they have a mission for me, and if would I take it? They had this big cruiser out in the ocean. I never saw it. It was so far out that they had a mission, that they found an ammunition depot that the pilots couldn't find, and their intelligence found it, and it was underground. I said I would watch them, spot them for them. So they did a terrific amount of barrage. And they told me to stay below 6,000 feet. And I wanted to stay as high as I could because I was way up north.
Yeah, and they're
I was
shooting
way
at you
up
from the
north,
ground.
And black puffs were coming all over the place.
Flak was in the air.
Yeah, black and white. You can tell the difference.
Really?
Different guns, yeah. After I saw what they did, they wanted me to go down and count the MIAs,
So go even lower.
KIAs.
Sure.
So I said, okay, but I can't see anything down there. I said, you guys cleaned it out.
Right.
It's 100%. I gave them 100% coverage
Wow.
for the target. So he said, well, go down there and see what you can see. So I went down there and I didn't see anything. So I said, I'm assuming that you demolished the whole place.
Right. Right.
And it looked good. It was all,
So
Devastating.
you were the only pilot, the only airplane
I was the only one there.
that was spotting for that.
That's right.
During World War II, Naval Air Station Glenview was fully enveloped in training carrier pilots who were crucial to our country's.
Okay, let's give a big welcome to Ed Marshall.
Well, as we used to say in the Navy, welcome aboard. The film is pretty self-explanatory. It was a great installation. What wasn't mentioned, or you would have seen it further on in the film, Glenview was the headquarters. Glenview was the headquarters for all the Naval Aviation Reserve training bases throughout the United States, including Navy, Marine Corps, and there was an admiral in charge of the Navy squadrons and a Marine general in charge of, and they were all operated out of Glenview. At one time, there were naval air stations all over, places like Ottumwa, Iowa, Nebraska, Brooklyn, New York. They're all gone now, as Glenview is, but it was quite an experience. I grew up in a barracks and enjoyed my life, went on to college, had a good career, and I owe it all to some of the training and things that the Navy instilled in me. Does anybody have any questions about what they saw or about the Glenview Naval Air Station?
Could you talk to the training of the air dispatch?
You have the floor, Colonel.
Could you talk to the air traffic controllers being trained also there?
Air traffic controllers were trained in
The Marine Corps trained them there.
Olathe, Kansas, is where the Navy and the Marines, Marine aviation personnel went to the same training schools that I did. If any of you have shopped in the Glen, the facade at Von Moore department store is part of Hangar 1. And that was the control tower. That's where the air controllers, there wasn't any problems like you have today in civilian airports. They were pretty well trained. Yes, sir.
I saw the landing craft or the aircraft carriers in Lake Michigan were pictured. I understand, I've heard that there are a lot of airplanes at the bottom of Lake Michigan.
They're still.
So I thought maybe you could discuss some of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
The two aircraft carriers that were out on Lake Michigan that were used for training for flight, for landing on an aircraft carrier were the Sable and the Wolverine. They were both former Lake Michigan excursion and boats that were converted. They put a wooden flight deck on board, and they were operated with steam engines. And they had sailors below the decks shoveling coal into the furnaces to keep the aircraft carriers going. But it was very important because our other pilot training programs were in Corpus Christi, Texas, and Pensacola, Florida. So this was inland. There was never any problem or threat from the Axis power. So it was a pretty good environment to learn to fly. But what would happen, because these were all aviation cadets, sometimes you wouldn't hit the carrier or wouldn't catch the wire and end up in the drink. So they're still pulling some of those aircraft out. Does that answer your? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
A few years ago, I visited a very tiny museum on Lehigh Avenue.
I also belong to the Hangar One Foundation, and we
Okay.
sponsor that museum.
Is that still there?
Well, it's only gonna be open through July.
Okay, and the second question is there any thought about expanding that or having a larger building to display those things?
Want to be critical of village governments and village bureaucracies. But for 30 years, the Hangar One Foundation, we've been approaching the village to build a museum. We spent a lot of money with architectural drawings and proposals. And last month, our last attempt was turned down by the village board, who some of the members spent some time in Canada during the Vietnam. No, I shouldn't say that. But anyway, but we made 2 weeks ago, we made one final attempt, and it's still up in the air. So, but I'm not overly optimistic. So we'll be open for another through July. The hours are from 1 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday, and I'm serve as a docent there occasionally.
I'd appreciate if you could just speak a little about your own career. I'd like to learn a little in the Navy.
Okay. Well, I entered boot camp a month after I was 17. The boot camp was in Bainbridge, Maryland. After boot camp, I had enlisted for naval aviation, and I went to an aviation fundamental school in Norman, Oklahoma. That's how spread out the Navy. And after completing that, I was sent to the parachute rigger school in Lakehurst, New Jersey for 3 months, and ending with a parachute jump with a chute that I packed myself. And then I was sent out to the fleet and was in an anti-submarine squadron out of Norfolk, Virginia, and did spend some time at Glenview. But most of my time was spent in a nice air-conditioned parachute loft, or the air conditioning when I left an aircraft. But that's about That's about it. Hi, this gentleman here.
No, it's me over here. It's my turn. My brother-in-law enlisted in the Navy when he was young, probably 17, 18, like that. And he ended up with a job guiding the planes onto the ships, on and off, or whatever. And he did it so long that when he left the Navy, he was mentally impaired, and he spent the rest of his life in VA.
Really?
Yeah, it was very bad.
You must have been an aviation bosun's mate. Those were the people who moved the planes around and
Yeah.
on the hangar deck and so forth.
Yeah,
Which
something.
is a very hazardous job to have.
Yeah, that's what he did, and it literally killed him. He eventually, I think he committed suicide. I'm not positive,
boy.
but he came out of the Navy, and he never recovered. Period.
Oh,
And he was a really nice young fella.
that was unfortunate. He's bringing you the microphone.
That are not from the area originally, what was the overall footprint of the Naval Air Station?
Well, as the film indicated, it originally was a Curtiss Wright airfield. The Navy bought it in 1939 as a reserve air station. Prior to that, naval aviation training in the Midwest was at Great Lakes. So when the Navy took it over, and with World War II approaching, it expanded, and at one point, there were all sorts of Navy personnel, Marine personnel, and near the end of the air station's life, Coast Guard rescue helicopters were at Glenview, as well as some Army aviation units. Ron has a question.
I just wanted to add that Great Lakes Navy Base had an airstrip which became Ross Field during World War One. And you could see where the old landing strip was at Great Lakes.
And they also had the ramps to pull the seaplanes out.
Right.
Yes.
And then at Fort Sheridan, we also had an airstrip that flew in over where it's now. It was last used as a gunnery post where they would shoot for rifle qualification out into the lake. There's a lot of lead and stuff.
Oh, sure, yeah.
At the bottom of Lake Michigan.
And now it's all high-priced real estate. Yes.
Right. But there was a short little landing strip that was right there.
They had the light observation planes.
Right, where they have the light observation planes. Okay.
Give it to the guy from the west side, right over there.
My personal observation, you packed the parachutes. And
You rig the parachutes.
you prepared them.
You pack the suitcase, you rig a parachute.
Well, you were the guy that had to be treated very well by everybody, correct?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, and they would watch you and make sure you didn't have an extra drink or so.
But we also had to sign a card that was inserted into the parachute that Ed Marshall rigged this chute,
Okay.
and that we don't give refunds.
In a question, the station for many years kind of was the home base for the air show.
Yes,
And over the years, just living a mile or so, we got to see with so much of the planes that came in and a couple tragedies that occurred there as well. I wonder if you wanted to just tell us a little.
well, there was a British bomber,
A huge one.
that the entire crew were killed, and we have a memorial to them
Right.
at the museum, at the Hangar One Foundation Museum. And there were several other incidents, but overall, even though there's a large residential area all around the base, it was, even in my day, there weren't any civilian fatalities. It was the British crew and then I think one or two other planes went in.
Well, we definitely want to thank you for your service and for those that went there. There's other questions.
Do you ever make it down to the pier?
Oh, sure. You're talking about Navy Pier. Oh, yeah, during World War II, it was a naval aviation training facility for aviation machinist mates and aviation metalsmiths. So they had a large naval contingent there.
Yeah, thank you again for your service.
You're just saying that because we're both from the west side.
That's true. But maybe many of you may remember on Saturday mornings, there were flights going out of Glenview Naval Air Station and Sunday afternoon coming back in. Maybe you could comment about the Orion P-3 and its role in the Navy and coming out of Glenview and its role in the sub-chasing.
Well, that was an anti-submarine aircraft. The piece in the video when Tommy was talking about he was in one of the VP squadrons that flew out of Glenview and they were primarily anti-submarine.
Ed, did you ever work on the USS Leyte? Leyte. It was one of the last of the
Aircraft carriers. I did my sea duty in the shower. I was never on a Navy
Okay,
ship.
all right.
Had a question here in the back. You have a few years on you, just like us. So you were in the Navy at a time that was different than today. Can you make any comparison about how you feel the Navy?
Oh, it's changed. I volunteer a couple of days a week at the USO at O'Hare. And all the Navy recruits who eventually are taken to Great Lakes come through the USO, and I try to prepare them for what they can experience. And I get a lot of strange looks when I say, it's been 69 years since I went to boot camp, but the fundamentals are still the same. Pay attention, do what you're told, and be focused. If you try to adhere to those three things, your life in boot camp will be a lot easier. And also during my time, women were mostly in clerical positions. Now they're in all the rates, bosun mates, gunner's mates, and so forth. So it's completely different from it was in my time of iron men and wooden ships.
On a lighter note, not really lighter, but let's not forget that there were also women and children living on the base. I was DOD there for 9 years. Actually, I was there for base closure, which was quite an experience. I taught at Kids World, which was the child care center for Navy personnel. And we had a lot of children where the parents were deployed. And so there are lots of different kinds of issues we dealt with, but it was working with the Navy people and it was quite an experience.
Thank you for doing that.
Pleasure.
And I have a question. Did you request parachute rigger school or did they assign
You had to request it. That's all volunteer, yes.
you volunteered?
Yeah.
Well, why did you do that?
Because of the $55 extra I got a month hazardous duty. No, it just seemed like it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I guess. Okay.
I opted for that rather than rabbinical school.
I live in Wilmette. near the Baha'i Temple.
And sure, there's a Coast Guard station.
Well, beyond that, yes.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I used to walk my dog down to the lake, and there was a concrete, it looked like steps. And somebody put a plaque on it that said George Bush got in planes here and practiced going out to the, is that a true story?
Yes, the pilots in training would use the Baha'i Temple as a vocal point when they were flying back to the air station after the carrier landing. So it was a very important figurehead for them to sight in on coming off of the lake and going up back to Glenview. Yes, they didn't, Glenview was just primary flight training. The final flight training was either done in Corpus Christi, Texas, or Pensacola, Florida, but they got the basics there and the toughest thing, that's why naval aviators are the premier pilots of the military. It's awful hard to land on a little postage stamp size thing bobbing around in the ocean. So carrier landings are very important and need a high degree of skill, as Ace Ridley mentioned in the video. He's a heck of a guy. He just passed away not too long ago. Yes.
Japan from 1954 to 56, we supported the Peter II Victor and Neptune, and it was Yoko, Japan, Circle Station, that's the two air forces that supported that. Did you understand it, country?
I never served overseas. I spent most of my time in the flesh pots of the Caribbean. But no, I have no knowledge of that.
Thank you for your service, sir.
Thanks for recognizing, and thank you for yours.
What you didn't mention, and I think people, maybe some people do know, that the carriers in Lake Michigan were considerably lower to the ground
Yes,
than the ones that were
lower
out
to
in
the
the ocean.
water.
The other thing
Yes.
was, I had a company, a platoon of airborne riggers in my company in the Army.
And they wore red hats, right?
I don't remember what the heck they were. It
Oh.
was 50 years ago. They rigged equipment. Now, I'm getting the impression that the only thing you rigged were backpacks for the pilots. You didn't rig any kind of equipment or anything, did you?
Oh, yeah, we also maintain all the life-saving equipment, life rafts, life vests,
But
emergency.
would you drop those from the air?
No, they were on the aircraft.
Okay, so you would rig
And every overwater flight, you're required to have and wear a life vest, and depending on the size of the aircraft and the number of men on board, rifle.
So you had to pack the life raft.
Yes.
Parachute. Okay.
We would test them parachutes had to be repacked every 30 days because of the static, like you'd hang them up overnight in a drying tower.
So the pilots that were on the aircraft carriers, did they have people like you packing their suits, or did they have?
Well,
to pack their
the
own?
fighter aircraft had ejection seats. We used to work on those, where you'd pull the face curtain down and the canopy would
I'm
blow
talking
away.
about World War II ones, World War II planes. They didn't have ejector seats in World War II,
No,
did
no. If you've seen some of the older movies, it shows the men walking around the aircraft with a chest chute.
Okay,
A
thank
chute
you.
on their chest.
Okay, I have a couple of observations. When you're trying to land on a carrier, you come down about 500 feet per minute. And I don't think most people can appreciate how fast you land to a spot going down 500 feet per minute. Would you comment?
And then you also have to catch a wire. The little hook on the end of the aircraft has to hook onto the wire. And a good pilot usually gets the third. The wires are stretched out across the fantail. A good pilot can get wire number 3.
One more question. I used to fly an airplane that required a seat chute. Did you pack seat chute?
Yes. There were seat chutes, chest chutes, and back chutes. And then we had a special training chute that we used to jump with, which was a little less elaborate. Do you know anything about the training of the people that guided the airplanes onto the runway, the aircraft? Well, those are the aviation bosun mates. Yeah, that's what my brother-in-law did. Yeah. And the school used to be in Philadelphia, and then all the aviation schools are now in Pensacola. But I served with aviation bosun mates, but I really don't know what all they did except tow the planes and bring the planes in and run all over the flight deck. And the fatality rate was pretty high, both physically and mentally among those men. I know.
Are there any more questions? Okay. Okay.
Just so everybody knows the kind of technology that the Navy had during the Gulf War, there was a program called SLAM. And I think you're familiar with SLAM. It was a process of shooting a weapon off of a submarine 1,500 miles away with an accuracy of plus or minus 1.5 meters. In other words, 5 feet from 1,500 miles away, shot off of a submarine. That's the kind of technology America has had. So you got to really, really be proud.
And this is from a qualified engineer and a former West Side resident.
So I don't know if this is true or not.
And done, it was designed and manufactured. Well, some of it designed, but it was manufactured here.
Give him the microphone. So I don't know if this is true or not, but I was stationed right outside of Norfolk at a little post called Fort Story.
That
And
means you were in the Army.
yeah, right.
I know Fort Story well. I used to go to the NCO club there. It was better than our petty officers club.
That's why I got into trouble. We were partying in Virginia Beach, and these guys would leave these because Oceana was down the other side of Virginia Beach.
The air station in Oceana.
Oceana was down the thing from the other side, and we would go to these parties, and they would leave this party drunk. And they had to hit the aircraft carrier Kennedy. They were off the Kennedy, and they had to hit the Kennedy, at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I was talking to a command officer one time, and he told me, I said, how did these guys actually be able to land when they left the party drunk?
They go to the parachute loft and inhale some oxygen.
That's what he said. As soon as you go on that oxygen, you sober up. Thank you for confirming that.
It's true.
Okay, maybe this one should be the last question right here.
Okay, you mentioned about parachuting. I used to joke that the military parachute, you come down about 13 feet per second, which is like jumping off a garage roof. And when you parachute, I'd like you to comment about your first few landings, because I used to joke that I was about as graceful as a shot crow.
Well, you had to remain flexible and bend your knees. We always tried to do a stand-up landing where we didn't. I did it a couple of times, but Yeah, most of the time, it's, yes. And weather conditions have something to do with it too.
Okay, Ed, thank you so much. That was wonderful.